World War II pushed engineering to its limits. Germany built some of the most advanced and bizarre machines of the era. But not all of them made it to the battlefield. Many ended up abandoned, forgotten, or rediscovered decades later. Strange relics of a dark chapter in history. From massive tanks buried in forests to experimental aircraft rotting in hangars, these are the strangest abandoned Nazi vehicles ever found. Hidden deep within the ruins of Nazi Germany's military ambitions lies one of the strangest and most excessive weapons ever conceived, the Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus. At first glance, it doesn't even look real. A steel giant weighing an unbelievable 188 tons, heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747 landing gear assembly, heavier than almost anything that had ever attempted to move across land. It was the heaviest tank ever built, and also one of the most impractical. The Maus was meant to be unstoppable. Its armor was so thick, up to 240 millimeters in places, that no Allied anti-tank weapon of the time could realistically pierce it. It carried a massive 128mm cannon supported by a 75mm secondary gun, turning it into a rolling fortress designed to obliterate anything in its path. On paper, it was terrifying. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. At 188 tons, the Maus could barely move. Its top speed was only about 13 kilometers per hour on solid ground, and even that strained its oversized engines. Most roads couldn't hold its weight. Asphalt crumbled beneath its tracks. Bridges were useless, and even rail transport, the backbone of German logistics, became nearly impossible. Moving the Maus was like trying to deploy a battleship on land. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed before the war ended. One was destroyed to prevent capture, but the other fell into Soviet hands. Engineers from the Red Army hauled it away to their testing grounds, fascinated by the absurd machine. But even they quickly realized it was little more than a curiosity, impressive in scale, useless in practice. For decades, the wreck sat hidden in depots, rusting away in the shadows of history. Eventually, historians and restorers brought the Maus back to life, not as a weapon, but as a relic. Today, it stands on display at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, towering over visitors who can hardly believe such a monster was ever real. Battle. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, proof that sometimes bigger isn't better, sometimes bigger is impossible. Discovered by the advancing Soviet army in Manchuria in 1945, the Kugelpanzer, or bull tank, remains one of the strangest vehicles ever built during World War II. At first sight, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like something that had rolled straight out of a science fiction film. A perfect metal sphere mounted on 2 wide wheels, with space inside for only a single operator. No gun, no turret, no obvious offensive capability at all. Just a narrow viewing slit at the front and a small engine compartment in the rear. For decades, its true purpose has remained one of military history's strangest mysteries. Some historians believe it was intended as a reconnaissance vehicle, using its compact, rounded design to move quietly and avoid being easily targeted. Others have suggested it might have been a cable-laying machine, designed to spool communication lines across battlefields while protecting its operator from shrapnel. A few theories even wander into the absurd. Ideas of suicide missions, chemical weapon deployment, or even psychological warfare, though none of these have been proven. What is certain is that the Kugelpanzer never reached mass production. The example captured in Manchuria is the only surviving specimen known to exist. It was shipped back to the Soviet Union, examined briefly by engineers who must have been as puzzled as modern historians, and then quietly forgotten. For years, it sat rusting in storage, an orphan of Nazi Germany's obsession with experimental designs. Today, the Kugelpanzer is preserved at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. Visitors walking past massive machines like the Maus or T-34 suddenly stumble upon the strange little sphere, sitting almost awkwardly among giants. Its alien appearance still sparks debate. Was it a failed prototype, a desperate last-minute invention, or simply an engineering dead end? No documents survive to explain it, and no other examples have ever been found. Unearthed in forgotten airfields after the war, the Blohm Voss BV 141 stands as one of the strangest aircraft designs ever attempted by Nazi Germany. At first glance, it looks more like a mistake in the blueprint than a finished machine. Its cockpit sat on the far right, enclosed in a glass gondola that gave the crew an almost panoramic view. Its engine, a massive BMW radial, was mounted to the left, balancing the asymmetry with a long boom carrying the tail. The result was an aircraft that looked hopelessly lopsided, as if it should spin out of control the moment it left the runway. And yet, somehow, it flew. The BV 141 was designed as a reconnaissance aircraft, a role where visibility mattered more than speed or firepower. The cockpit's unusual placement gave the crew excellent sight lines in every direction, something most conventional planes of the era couldn't match. German test pilots reported that despite its bizarre appearance, the aircraft was surprisingly stable in the air. The off-center layout, instead of dooming it, actually worked as intended. A rare example of engineering madness that succeeded. But success didn't guarantee survival. The Luftwaffe already had the reliable Focke-Wulf FW-189 in mass production, a conventional twin-boom reconnaissance plane that did the job without raising eyebrows. The BV-141, meanwhile, faced delays, engine shortages, and a growing sense among Nazi command that such an eccentric design was not worth prioritizing. Only a handful were ever built, and most never saw active service. When the war ended, several BV-141s were found abandoned on German airfields. Their strange shapes puzzled Allied soldiers who stumbled across them, looking more like experimental prototypes than practical machines. Most were quickly scrapped for metal, their unusual frames reduced to rubble. Today, no complete BV-141 survives. Only photographs of wrecks and fragments remain, haunting black and white images of aircraft lying broken in fields, a reminder that they were once real. The largest tank never built, the Landkreuzer P87 Ratte, was a machine so enormous, so absurd, that it has become a legend of military excess. Unlike other Nazi superweapons that reached prototype stage, the Ratte never left the drawing board. It existed only on paper, as a set of blueprints discovered by the Allies in abandoned German archives after the war. Yet even on paper, it was terrifying. The Ratte was envisioned as a 1,000-ton land battleship, a steel monster larger than most houses and heavier than any bridge could hope to support. Its sheer scale defied logic. Measuring 35 meters long and 11 meters high, it would have dwarfed not just tanks, but entire buildings. The design called for two 280mm naval cannons, the same guns mounted on German battleships like the Gneisenau, supported by multiple secondary turrets, anti-aircraft guns, and machine gun nests. In essence, it wasn't really a tank at all, but a moving fortress. On paper, the Ratte was unstoppable. Its armor was to be so thick that no contemporary weapon could destroy it. Its firepower would have been enough to level entire city blocks or annihilate armored divisions in a single barrage. But the reality was very different. A machine of that size would have been practically immobile. No bridge in Europe could carry its weight. Most roads would collapse under its massive tracks. Its fuel consumption would have been astronomical, draining Germany's already failing logistics. And its giant silhouette would have made it an easy target for bombers, which could reduce it to scrap before it ever reached the battlefield. Even Nazi officials realized the absurdity. By 1943, the project was quietly shelved, along with other so-called Wunderwaffe designs that looked impressive but offered no practical value. The blueprints were left to gather dust until Allied forces uncovered them, astonished at the scale of what German engineers had dared to imagine. The Junkers Ju 87, better known by its infamous nickname Stuka, was one of the most recognizable aircraft of the Second World War. With its inverted gull wings, fixed landing gear, and the chilling mechanical sirens attached to its undercarriage, the Stuka became a symbol of fear during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. As it dove toward its targets, the sirens screamed through the sky, earning the aircraft a psychological reputation as much as a physical one. Civilians and soldiers alike learned to dread the distinctive howl that preceded a devastating bombing run. During the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the Stuka proved devastatingly effective. Its precision dive bombing made it invaluable for destroying fortifications, bridges, and convoys, clearing the path for advancing German forces. But its dominance didn't last. By the middle years of the war, Allied fighters had grown faster, more agile, and better armed. Against Spitfires, Hurricanes, and later Mustangs, the slow and cumbersome Stuka became an easy target. By 1943, it was largely withdrawn from frontline operations and repurposed for ground attack roles where the Luftwaffe still held air superiority. One of the rarest surviving examples of this once feared warplane was uncovered in late 2014 in an unlikely resting place, the depths of the Adriatic Sea off the Croatian island of Žirje, near Šibenik. The aircraft had crash-landed during the April 1941 Axis invasion of Yugoslavia, when the Regia Aeronautica's Ju-87 R2s took part in attacks on Yugoslav naval bases. Submerged in relatively shallow cold waters for over 70 years, the wreck was astonishingly well preserved thanks to the favorable underwater environment. Divers reported that the fuselage, wings, tailplane sections, cockpit instruments, and armament remained largely intact, though the engine was detached and lying nearby, likely torn off during impact. The Military Museum of Croatia quickly identified the plane, and it was declared a protected cultural heritage site. Some parts, like the MG-15 machine gun and cockpit control elements, were removed for preservation. German engineers, always searching for new ways to outmaneuver their enemies, developed one of the strangest weapons of the Second World War: the Goliath tracked mine. At first glance, it looked like a miniature tank, less than 2 meters long, with a low, boxy body, small tracks, and a cable trailing behind it. But this was no reconnaissance vehicle. The Goliath was, in essence, a remote-controlled demolition charge on wheels. Packed with explosives, its sole purpose was to crawl toward an enemy tank, bunker, or bridge, wedge itself in place, and then be detonated from a safe distance. The concept was simple yet ambitious. The operator, positioned under cover, controlled the Goliath through a spool of wire connected to a handheld box. By moving levers, he could steer the little vehicle across open ground, directing it under enemy armor or into fortifications. Once in position, the operator would trigger the charge, destroying the Goliath along with its target in a thunderous blast. Thousands of these machines were built between 1942 and 1945. They were deployed on both the Eastern and Western fronts, particularly in urban battles where German forces hoped they could clear obstacles or disable enemy tanks without risking infantry. However, in practice, the Goliath proved deeply flawed. Its armor was extremely thin, offering no real protection from small arms, fire, grenades, or even debris. The wiring system, essential for control, was notoriously fragile. A single cut or snag rendered the machine useless. Mud, snow, and uneven terrain often stopped the little tracked vehicle dead in its tracks before it reached its target. Because of these limitations, the Goliath never achieved the battlefield impact its designers had hoped for. Many were abandoned in place after malfunctioning or being disabled, left to rust where they failed. Allied troops encountering them often dismissed the weapon as little more than a curiosity, a symbol of over-engineering rather than battlefield efficiency. The V-2 rocket was Nazi Germany's most advanced long-range weapon, the world's first operational ballistic missile, capable of striking targets more than 300 kilometers away. It represented a terrifying leap in technology. A weapon that traveled faster than the speed of sound and could hit its target without warning, impossible to intercept by any means available at the time. But such a revolutionary missile required an equally complex and mobile support system. To move, assemble, and launch these weapons, the Germans relied on rail shipments to forward depots and on specialized road convoys, including Milewagen erector trailers and fuel trucks, to prepare launches from concealed forest clearings. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered the true scale of this logistics network in places like the underground Mittelwerk complex in Germany, where V2s had been assembled and staged for transport. Archives record that more than 300 railcar loads of V2 rockets and parts were seized and shipped for technical evaluation, notably to the United States, replacing rumors and wartime folklore with a documented picture of how the system actually worked. Surviving transport fixtures, flatbed cradles, handling jigs, fueling gear, and storage containers helped historians reconstruct the missile supply chain from factory to field. What wartime civilians sometimes remembered as mystery trains were, in reality, ordinary rail consignments feeding mobile road units rather than dedicated launch trains sealed away in tunnels. Though it was designed before the Second World War, this bizarre pre-war German experiment remains one of the strangest trains ever conceived. To modernize, it looked less like a locomotive and more like the fuselage of an airplane awkwardly placed on a set of railway wheels. Long, sleek, and metallic, with a streamlined nose and a massive aircraft propeller bolted to the rear, it was an engineering hybrid that seemed to belong neither entirely to the sky nor to the rails. Officially known as the Schienenzeppelin, or Rail Zeppelin, the single prototype train was built in the early 1930s, a period of rapid innovation in both aviation and transportation. Engineers wanted to see if the aerodynamic principles of aircraft design could be applied to rail travel, creating a machine capable of unheard-of speeds. On paper, the idea seemed promising. Use lightweight construction, streamline the body, and replace the traditional steam engine with an aircraft-style propeller drive. The result was extraordinary. In 1931, the Schienenzeppelin set a world railway speed record of 230.2 kilometers per hour, about 143 miles per hour, a mark not surpassed by any rail vehicle until 1954, and still the land speed record for a petrol-powered rail car. Watching it thunder down the tracks must have been a surreal sight. A train that looked and sounded more like an airplane preparing for takeoff. Yet for all its brilliance, the design was riddled with flaws. The exposed propeller at the back was extremely dangerous, posing a constant hazard to anyone near the train at stations. The lightweight single car frame couldn't pull additional coaches, and the experimental drive was impractical for everyday use. More importantly, Germany's railway network was simply not designed for such speeds at the time. The Schienenzeppelin could set records in carefully staged tests, but it could not function as a reliable passenger train. By the late 1930s, the futuristic machine was already obsolete. It was laid up and, in 1939, dismantled and scrapped for materials, its revolutionary design reduced to piles of melted metal. The Volkswagen Schwimmwagen, Type 166, was one of the strangest hybrid vehicles of the Second World War. A car that could drive on land and then roll straight into a river to float like a boat. Developed from the iconic Volkswagen Kugelpanzer, the Schwimmwagen was essentially a rugged off-road car, fitted with a watertight hull, a retractable propeller, and a bow-shaped front end designed to cut through water. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary military jeep with oversized wheels and a canvas roof. But the moment its propeller was lowered and the driver steered into a river, it transformed into something extraordinary, a fully amphibious machine. Between 1942 and 1944, around 14,000 Schwimmwagen rolled off German assembly lines, making it the most produced amphibious car in history. It became a common sight on the Eastern Front, where rivers, marshes, and flooded terrain made mobility a constant challenge. German engineers had built the vehicle to be versatile, capable of carrying troops, messages, and small supplies across areas where bridges had been destroyed or where boats were too scarce to use. For its time, the Schwimmwagen was a marvel, sturdy, reliable, and surprisingly effective in both mud and water. But like so many specialized machines of the war, its success was also its downfall. The further German forces advanced, the more rivers they had to cross, and the more Schwimmwagen were lost. Retreats often left them abandoned in lakes, swamps, and rivers when fuel ran out or when advancing Allied troops cut off escape routes. Some sank during hurried crossings, others were simply driven into the water and left behind. With its rear-mounted, air-cooled V8 engine, sleek aerodynamic body, and advanced engineering, the Tatra T87 was unlike anything else on the roads of Europe during the 1930s and 40s. Built in Czechoslovakia before the war, it was a car of elegance and innovation, designed not for battlefields, but for effortless long-distance travel. Its streamlined body, crafted under the influence of early aerodynamic studies, allowed it to reach speeds approaching 160 kilometers per hour, about 100 miles per hour, far beyond most cars of its era. For German officers stationed across Nazi-occupied territory, it quickly became a symbol of prestige and danger. Ironically, the very qualities that made the T87 a masterpiece of engineering also gave it a deadly reputation. Many officers who requisitioned the car were unprepared for its speed or its unusual rear-engine handling characteristics. Accidents became so frequent and so often described as fatal that the T87 earned the grim nickname of a soldier killer. When the war turned against Germany, the T-87s scattered across occupied Europe were abandoned as quickly as they had been seized. Dozens were left behind in Poland, Ukraine, and the former Czechoslovakia. Some were wrecked in forests, crumpled against trees after high-speed crashes. Others were discovered rusting on rural roadsides, deserted in the chaos of retreat. In the post-war years, the Tatra T87 became a rare collector's prize, valued for its futuristic design and engineering heritage. Still, scattered across barns, fields, and forgotten sheds, rusted hulks of these cars occasionally emerge, silent relics of a different side of the war. Not brutal machinery built for killing, but a civilian marvel co-opted by an occupying force. The T-87 remains one of the strangest vehicles associated with the Nazi era, not because it was a weapon, but because it blurred the line between elegance and tragedy. A car built for progress that, in the wrong hands, became one of the most ironically deadly machines of its time. If you had fun watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the next video waiting for you.